Hey, what's up? This is going to be the kind of part two of why Max or magnetic accelerators suck. This will be the Space Engineer specific component. Obviously, there's no Mac in Space Engineers, but we do have the Railgun, which functionally speaking is actually identical. Now, the title sort of hits up the punchline. I don't think the Railgun is very good, and I'm here to sell you on it. Before getting started, don't take it too seriously. Some people take a lot of offense to being told their favorite thing sucks. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. This is a sandbox game, and if you enjoy using it or you've had success with it, keep doing you. This is just my opinion because, it's fun to discuss these things and how my experience has related a certain weapon in Space Engineers and why I think it's bad. Whatever, right? People like discussing games. Alright, let's get into it. I'm going to mention a couple situations where I think the Railgun doesn't really suck. Number one, if you're in a resource-rich situation, namely survival where you're incredibly well established, the Railgun actually provides a decent amount of utility, namely potentially lights outing a PvE ship that is just moving in a linear path, right? You can perfectly line up the shot. You can destroy hostile bases from basically outside of effective weapon range. It also works kind of in that regard as a siege weapon. It's also the cool factor, right? We're ultimately here to have fun, and damn, this thing looks pretty cool when it shoots. And finally, I guess you could also make this thing utterly insane by turning it into a player-made weapon and gimbaling like 6 of these together, and then sure, it starts getting pretty insane and very effective. But I'm going to talk about it from the context of a balance perspective, where everything costs something and has an opportunity cost. Building these guys ain't cheap. And from the perspective of trying to analyze what makes something good or bad, you have to kind of talk about what a thing takes up and how it compares to the competition, right? So I'm going to mainly actually view this as an axial weapon. Once again, I'm going to ignore that player-made weapon component because yes, you could chain like 50 of these things together and one-shot ships. But at that point, you could have made a lot of things in one-shot ships. Like, I don't know, if you really know what you're doing, you can make a VLS torpedo cruiser, which functionally has an infinite range and would actually shit on this thing, right? So I'm only viewing it from within the vanilla framework as an axial weapon. No player-made weapons, because player-made weapons break the entire balance paradigm anyway. All right, let's get into it. We did a couple of tests, not only as a railgun in an isolated test environment, but we actually also have a similar weapon on our server that actually has significantly better stats. And our PvP server, we do PvP battles all the time, as the name implies. And we've had something like 30 to 40 major PvP battles so far, and about 10 or so of them were kind of testing this weapon and trying to make it or shoehorn this weapon into the meta. The reality was it didn't really work, but we have reasons and experience as to why that was the case. Let's start off with the test real quick. We did a couple of tests, some 4v4s and 3v3s, where we had identical ships on both sides. One side started with 1 railgun per ship and no other weapons, and the other side was Gatling guns, only per ship, 10 apiece. Once again, this is a test. Typically, you won't have a ship with just 10 Gatling guns, although you actually could. That would be a good starter ship, like a low-budget starter ship, but for sure, you're not just putting a railgun on a ship and calling it a day. Once again, this is a test that kind of represents the ability, or as you'll see, the inability of a railgun to actually do much of anything. Round 1, test results were as expected. Gatling gun side won very handily. Basically, just completely ground down the hostile ships, while the railgun ships were able to inflict damage, but were never able to really kill a ship. We rinse and repeated this many times, and every time the railgun side lost, what is grammar, we put another railgun on the PvP ships, and they would start with 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. I'll skip the suspense. The railgun side lost every single time until we gave up. We got to 6 railguns, and one of the ship had 8 railguns. And then we said F it, and we moved on with our lives. The reality was that even the weakest weapon, the Gatling gun, while not really being that great, right? They never really killed the ships. They kind of just turned into these flaming hunks, and then we just called it there. Granted, I'm not saying Gatling guns are amazing. They're really not. And most of these battles just sort of devolved into ramming when the railgun side got fed up. Even with one railgun for every 2 Gatling guns, the railgun side still lost handily. Let's skip all this lead up. Where am I getting with this? Where does this lead us? Why do Mac guns suck? Why do railguns suck in Space Engineers? Number 1, the railgun is too slow to hit moving targets consistently to justify their reload speed. It's not that they're slow, they're not. And it's not that their reload time is long, it's not that long. It's that it's both not that fast and you have a reload time. I'd be okay with a 40-second reload time if I'm basically shooting something a fraction of the speed of light and I'm basically hitting all my shots. But I'm not. These things actually travel fairly slow, relatively speaking, in terms of hitting a target. So, if I had a faster reload speed, it could work, but I don't. It's a combination of a bad reload speed and a bad velocity. At the moment, depending on how good you are as a player in a true PvP fight where the ships are trying to dodge and constantly trying to stay alive while dealing damage to you, you have anywhere from a 1 in 10, so a 10% chance, a 20% chance, all the way up to a 40% hit rate, depending on your skill level as a pilot. I'd say most people would be in the 20% hit rate range, so 1 in 5 shots are a hit. But we had a couple of players that were basically hitting all of their shots. It really depends on you as a player, because it's a skill weapon, basically. But the reality is, Space Engineers PvP is quite brutal, and it's typically over in under 5 minutes. This means, at most, you're hard capped to 5 or 6 shots per gun, but realistically it ends up being half that, 2 to 4 shots, probably 2 to 3 shots, because when your gun comes up ready to reload, you're probably not ready to take the shot. You still need to line up the shot or even make sure you're in position to take the shot, so on and so forth, because you want to make your shots count, so you're going to do what you need to do to line up that shot. You get what I'm saying. The end result is you have 2 to 4 shots over a fight with, realistically speaking, for most players, about a 30% hit rate. That typically means a single railgun in a 5-minute fight could have close to 100% miss rates, or maybe 1 hit. That is pretty devastatingly bad. But here's the thing, let's pretend you had a 100% hit rate, which you absolutely don't. I don't care what you said. Everyone that's come up into this server and it's like, I'm a railgun god, finds out that in reality, if you go up against PvP designed ships that are incredibly agile, you don't get that 100% hit rate. But let's pretend you had that 100% hit rate. The railgun actually doesn't even do enough damage when you get your hit rates. Everyone thinks the railgun are amazing because on paper they deal an incredible amount of damage, but the issue is how they deal their damage, and they functionally just ice pick your ship, right? They bore a little small hole in a straight path through about 6 or so something blocks, relatively speaking. I don't know the exact number, I forgot. We did a bunch of testing early on, but I forgot those numbers. This, functionally speaking, is actually a terrible way to kill Space Engineer ships, because Space Engineer ships don't really care about stuff like that. All the systems in Space Engineers, other than ammo conveying and hydrogen porting, is independent. Your reactor just needs to exist on the block, so as long as you don't hit the reactor, that reactor is 100% functional at all times, right? It's worth noting, most of our Space Engineer ships are incredibly PvP optimized, though they still look quite cool. And this is after about 1 year of constant PvP fighting, so you may find it a little different if you have a lot less optimized ships, but the end result is, roughly the same thing. Most Space Engineer ships are mostly non-vital systems, considering how small vital systems are, batteries, reactors, hydrogen tanks, right? Relative to the size of the ship, they're very small, and if you draw a random line through the ship, you're probably only going to hit maybe 1, maybe 2 of these components. You'll never take out, the ship in one go. And remember our low rate of fire. Even if you do take out the critical hydrogen tank, most ships have backups. You take out all the hydrogen tanks, most ships have ion backups. You take out the reactor, most ships have backup reactors or even primary reactors. Space Engineer ships are ludicrously resilient, and I think most of us have seen fights where you basically flight to borderline the last block, right? You take out the CIC, you go to a different seat randomly placed on the ship. It still works. For a while there, magazine racking and hydrogen tank explosions were really cute and actually kind of made these things seem really good on paper, but then everyone just figured out, don't make a magazine, just disperse your ammo throughout the ship in small quantities in cargo containers, and functionally as a mechanism, this kind of just went away. You could see my video up here about how we kind of approach that. The end result is, as I've stated, the railgun pokes a lot of little holes in your ships, and sometimes it hits something important, but more often than not, you only destroy some minor subsystems. Let's keep going. What's another issue? Well, the railguns don't actually outrange anything, because the difference between the railgun's range and a turret's effective range is actually almost functionally nothing. Now, if the railgun could hit out to, 10,000 meters, okay, now we're talking. Now the railgun has a niche, but it doesn't. Now the railgun has a niche, but it doesn't. It's basically functioning the same as lock-on range. And due to the long reload time of railguns and the fact that PvP is chaotic, functionally speaking, the railgun's effective range is the same range turrets come into play at. And that kind of destroys one of the things that on paper should be an advantage for the railgun. What's another issue? Well, no splash damage. Yes, they'll have incidental splash damage because you're drilling a hole through the ship, and, well, that's kind of splash damage, and you also will be, blowing things up because you're going to hit something probably, and that'll blow up and deal some splash damage. But functionally speaking, you're just drilling tiny holes. This is in contrast to functionally basically all the other guns in the game. The Gatling turrets, or the projectile weapons, like the Gatling turret and the Assault and RT turret, don't have true high explosive, but they have a splash zone, right, due to inherent inaccuracy of moving targets and the inherent inaccuracy of the weapon. So you get kind of a splash area. You get the missile, which is literally a splash. And, that's the only two weapon types. In PvP, it's not necessarily about winning to destroy your enemy ship, it's about winning the battle, which for some people that sounds very similar to the uninitiated, but in a PvP battle, anyone or everyone will take disabling a ship in about 1 minute versus killing a ship in more, so 3 minutes, for example. Right? Because option 1 allows you to disable that ship and then move on to a new target and influence the battle. Turn a bunch of 1v1s into a 2v1. Right? That's how you win battles. And while in theory the railgun is really good at killing ships by taking out a vital system, they're actually really bad at destroying systems that keep the ship running. So thrusters and the guns. You don't have a gun, you're functionally useless beyond ramming, which is typically not a good investment. Or you lose your thrusters and you can't move anymore and you're sitting duck, and typically at that point ships pull out. Right? And in that paradigm, AoE damage from missiles or even Gatling guns, not really, but even so, missiles and the other weapons are far more effective at influencing a win in a battle than some Hail Mary blow the ship up with a single shot situation. Finally, we get into the last category, resource cost, both in physical space and literal resource cost. Railguns are pricey mamma jambas. They take up a huge amount of space on your ship. They require a not insignificant electrical cost, which is why you can't mount them to fighters typically. And the ammo is also not cheap. So, functionally speaking, when resources are at all a concern, and there are many times this is the case, both in a RP sense, right, if you don't want to gun spam your ship, and in a survival sense where you actually have to mine the actual resources, the railgun just doesn't do its job efficiently to justify the cost of having the railgun in the first place. The artillery turret is actually better at penetrating because you do a lot of small holes, which actually begin to add up for something. Now, don't get me wrong, I think the artillery turret is also underbalanced compared to explosive weapons, but it's better than the railgun. And then the missile-based weapons are, while not inexpensive, are significantly more cheap than the railguns, and they do a lot of effective style damage, as I've discussed. And then obviously the Gatling gun, in terms of being an efficient weapon, is by far and away the most efficient weapon due to the type of resource it's required to build the ammo and the turret. So yeah, basically across the board, in my opinion, in basically every single category mentioned so far, the railgun is just by far the worst contender of all the weapon systems available to us without dipping into the realm of player-made weapons. Now, there are situations where it kind of makes sense, like I've mentioned, but I'll hit up a couple more. Mainly, the biggest one is the railgun is useful on ships that are already properly configured, and you have kind of a unlimited budget, and you can kind of shove in 2 railguns as just added utility, as I mentioned. When contact is made, we notice it works kind of well as an opening salvo weapon, and then you fire it, and then you kind of ignore it until somebody wanders directly in front of your ship at like 200 meters, and then you shoot the gun, and it's very useful in that regard. The railgun also typically survives quite long in a fight, so your weapons will weapon strip the enemy, and then you still have like a backup weapon to a degree. But this is an unfair comparison because in a apples to apples comparison, if you have a railgun and 10 Gatling guns, well then at minimum your enemy probably has 20 Gatling guns, or whatever weapon type, right? The gun costs you something, right? So which is why you kind of need a situation where, well, you have unlimited resources, which is not a realistic scenario, to be frank. Looking into our weapon, our railgun equivalent, we've done a lot of testing to try to make it work because, to be frank, a lot of people wanted it to work because it's such a cool gun or weapon. And they did a lot more than the other weapons to try to make it work. The end result was, it kind of worked as an opening salvo weapon, as mentioned. And our one is significantly stronger. Way more damage, if not 10 times more damage. Also has splash damage, and it also has a 19-kilometer range. And even then, it really struggled to get off the ground. I think the two scenarios where we saw it being useful was in very, very large ships that have basically unlimited budget, and they're designed to kill other very large ships. And then number two was the destroyer swarm meta that was tried out, where you basically shove this on a destroyer, and you, with the other destroyers, basically walk up to point blank on a critical kill target, put the barrel up that ship's butt, pull the trigger once, and then run away. And you probably wouldn't make it away. You'd probably be dead because the escort kills you, but the goal was to sacrifice 4 destroyers to kill one ship for sure. In reality, it had middling to laughable results, but it was tried. So, there is some use case scenarios, but functionally speaking, it really boils down to, at minimum and at best, the railgun is hyper niche, but even within that niche, it is overpriced beyond belief compared to its performance, and it honestly could use a buff. But man, does it look cool. I think they spent all the budget on looking cool. This was filmed on the Get Brocked Outlands survival/event server. You can check out my pinned video on my channel if you want more information regarding. It's a PvP, RP, turn-based /D&D style thing, right? There's no active server beyond events, but watch that video. You'll know what it is. And if not, just keep watching the channel. I'm gonna do that typical YouTube shill thing. Please throw your comments down below. Let me know what you think and your experience with the railgun. And then finally, thanks guys. Thanks for all the support, especially the mega pimps on Patreon that are keeping this mess going. It is not cost effective to run this channel, but it's a passion project, and having people that are willing to give me their money to both cover costs of the server and other things, as well as just the time commitment, really means a lot. Thanks guys. Regardless, I'll see you guys around for the next one.